Hi, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Today, we're going to talk about compliance and sanctions. I know this has become sort of like a hot topic lately, but we wanted to talk about it because it's really important to stay in compliance and have your checks and balances. So, sanctions are penalties or other means of enforcement used to provide incentives for obedience with the law or other rules and regulations. And I know that, some of us have a hard time accepting certain sanctions, and sometimes we are not even aware. So that becomes a problem. Sometimes us or a client could send the money to a country that's kind of sanctioned, so you're not allowed to do that. So what happens when the money is actually being sent to that country? So basically, the recipient is not going to receive the money, but the monetary penalties imposed, they're going to be deposited to the state treasury, to the credit of the state fund. So the Department of Criminal Justice does not benefit from these monetary penalties, but you the short story is that you're not going to be getting the money back and the vendor is not going to be paid. And Irene could talk more about that, but this is basically the short answer. So it's very, very important to make sure that we have due diligence, screening, and monitoring. And if you have international vendors, it's really important to be on top of all the regulations and laws that come out. And sometimes it's easier to outsource or maybe have somebody in on staff who could be monitoring this. And um, I kind of wanted to go to Irene to talk about the consequences of not being compliant, and maybe Irene could give us a few examples of what happens.
Absolutely. We've had a couple of cases over the last year and a half that are really quite unique, but they're unique not in they're unique to this situation, but not necessarily unique to what we see going on globally. So they're unique to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And what I mean is we have had a couple of cases where our client's business was funded by whether it's Russian businesses or a Russian bank or a Russian owned bank. And so they were no longer able to use the source of funds and the source of income that they thought that they would be able to use, because those are subject now to penalties and those are subject now to sanctions. And so we've actually had funding that has been isolated only to sanctioned countries. And we've seen this before when we've had other countries globally that have been subject to sanctions, where businesses have been isolated to their funding only from one place and one place only, that this has come up. And this has been quite a problem. But here it has been specifically because, again, it's in the media. This has been a specific problem because we've had so much investment coming in from Russian owned banks or businesses over the last few years that we've actually seen. Like I said, we have two of our clients that, unfortunately, to cease operations entirely, are pending and fundraising once again. But they were essentially unable to work. Now, what happened there was they had a full funding coming out of a sanctioned country. In this case, that was out of Russia, and they were not diversified at all. There were no other credit lines. And so when they were no longer able to use the funds, two questions really arose. Can they use the funds that they already received? That was one. And the second question was, can they now, as a business opened by receiving funds from a country subject to sanctions, can they continue to operate if they were to obtain funding elsewhere? And this was not, unfortunately, just not something that we could find the answer to directly, because these sanctions were so new, and that's always what happens. But after consulting, we consulted with tax counsel, and we consulted with counsel handling international matters, especially specifically with sanctions, given the way that the funding had come in, that they were 100% funded by a sanctioned country. The advice there was that they can no longer continue to operate. And so they actually had to seize all operations. And that's when it became very important that they looked at all the money that they did receive over years past, accounted for it, put it on their books, but they did shut down. It caused a bigger problem down the line as well, because one of them, for example, rented space. That space was for approximately $40,000 per month was their leased space. Again, they could no longer make the rent payments, but they're personally liable. So these are United States citizens who received funding from a sanctioned country. So it's not that they themselves could use at least the excuse or reason that they themselves were subject to the sanctions. It's just the funding that they use. But given that they have a personal guarantee, what do we do now in a situation like this? They have no other funding coming in. And what do we do? And so this is why it's so important. And again, this was a very unique situation, the way that we had to work it out with the landlord and work it out on documents. But this is why it's just so important to look ahead and see where your funding comes from, diversify, have everything on the books, and make sure that if you do have any funding coming in from anywhere outside of the United States, that those countries have never been on a sanction list before, because that was something that had they looked at it, and no one could foresee this, but they could at least try to diversify just a bit, or at least also have a backed up credit line. And this is why that bookkeeping and having your records in order is so important, because unless you really see all of that, technically, if you take every day as it goes and you look at it day by day, the funding is there, they were able to make the payments and everything was fine. But in this specific situation, they're now subject to multitude of lawsuits because they were personally liable for so many things, including inventory, including that lease that was very expensive. And when you multiply that by 10 years, at $40,000 a month, you can imagine what the landlord would be suing for, especially considering they technically, as they ceased operations, aren't even able to really leave the space. They're still pending future advice on what to do next from other counsel and from their tax professional. So they cannot even leave the space. So that money just continues to grow and grow against them personally. So this is something that's so important when you see it on your books and you realize that all of your funding may be coming from one place. That's when you realize, okay, it's time to diversify. But without having all that on record and having everything in front of you, it's just too difficult to not get in the day to day and just think that everything is going all right. So this is why we continue to talk about how important it is to make sure that all the record keeping is there and everything is taken care of continuously. Just making sure at least every week you're checking on those on what you have on your books, making sure that you have a good budget down, making sure that you have all your records in order, and so on. It's so important to do that. That's why I think Jane and I continue to talk about this week over week, and this was just another example of that here. So if there are any questions on this or in any of these situations, as unique as it was to this specific situation and specifically to Russia here, we've seen this come up so many times in other sanctions countries. So if there are any questions at all, please always feel free to reach out to Jane or I, and we're always happy to help. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.